What happened to my Sasquatch?
This was the names of the characters. And this was Krishna.
Yeah, I've got that. Oh, did y'all give me back my little yellow thing?
Hi, everyone. Sorry.
Hi, good evening.
Are we ready? Oh, not?
7:01.
Okay.
What is wrong with you all?
Okay, Julie says we're jumping the gun.
Oh, okay.
7:02. You might have to hit something.
It says live.
Oh my God, is it mine? I'm gonna sign on my phone.
I think we're good.
Hello.
Can you see yourself?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our book talk, which is basically our our fall local author series event. I'm Sheridan Gates, and sorry if it's a little awkward. We're having some computer challenges, but we think we've got it figured out. So I'm here with Phyllis and Julie. And I was just going to kick us off quickly with a few updates about Friends of the Library in general, and then Phyllis is going to introduce our lovely guest for the evening. I am supposed to remind everybody to order your nuts and join Friends of the Library. I think, it's not backwards, actually. You should have gotten your nuts, which would have formerly known as the shortbread order form. You should have gotten this in the mail, and it's now all about nuts. So please order those by November 5th, and the pickup is going to be on the day of our holiday books and coffee.
Just the 19th.
The 19th is the pickup day. We have a meeting. Our next board meeting is October 27th, and we are going to do that in person at the sports complex at 1. So hopefully nothing will change about that, and we can all meet together. Do have to wear masks, but we should be able to have our first in-person meeting, which is so exciting. We will be getting information out in the next day or so on a fun new event with Kimmery Martin on November 9th. And part of the invitation will highlight the fact that we are going to have everybody come to the lovely new Gambrell Center so we can check out that space. And that will be that's an exciting new event. We'll be hearing from Kimmery. Her new book is Doctors and Friends, and that's on November 9th at 7 p.m. And then Holiday Books and Coffee is the 19th, like we talked about, from 10 to 12. And that's also when you can pick up your nuts after Holiday Books and Coffee. And that is featuring Denise Kiernan. We gather together. Oh, Julie is sending me a note that along with ordering nuts, please remember to rejoin Friends of the Library. Yes. We had a very successful and fun kickoff event at High Cotton Home at Park Road Shopping Center, where we had a great turnout. Phyllis's lights are dimming. We might be experiencing a power outage.
No, I hope not. Sometimes
so
that happens.
Without further ado, join Friends of the Library, order your Hubs nuts, and I'm going to turn it over to Phyllis to introduce Megan Miranda.
Well, I'm delighted to tell you we have Megan Miranda, and I can't tell which way I'm supposed to go here. Oh, I'm going this way. Okay. Technical difficulties are just part of the world we're living in right now, especially with virtual events. But we're delighted to have Megan. It's fun because Megan actually lives in our area up in Davidson, and she is a master of the psychological thriller. I have read a number of her books. The one that we're featuring, and I have it right here in front of me, Such a Quiet Place, is her newest book, which came out in July. And I had the pleasure of reading this book early because I got an advanced reader copy, and I can assure you, you're going to enjoy it when you read it. I have read a number of her books. The Last House Guest was the one that Reese Witherspoon picked for her book of the month, and I guess it was your opening month, July. and it was on the New York Times bestseller list. I've also read The Girl from Widow Hills, All the Missing Girls, The Perfect Stranger. So Megan, I said to somebody the other day, she reminds me a lot stylistically of the way Agatha Christie used to set up novels, and where you had a lot of red herrings out there about, well, it could be this person, but it might also be somebody else. So I'm going to turn this over. Megan lives in Davidson. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Megan. She'll tell you a little bit about herself and the way she sets her novels up.
Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm excited to be here and to chat with everyone today. I have been a lifelong mystery and suspense reader. I always like to thank you so much for the comparison to Agatha Christie. I've loved all of her books. I grew up kind of devouring mysteries. I think I was always drawn to this idea of the mysteries, not only in the stories, but the mysteries inside other people. And that's sort of what drives the inspiration behind my stories. The truth is, though I was a lifetime reader and I've always loved to write, this is actually my third career. I took sort of a roundabout path to becoming a writer, but I feel like all of those steps in hindsight kind of inspired the types of stories I tell today, and each step has gotten me to where I am. So though I loved writing, I also loved science. And I went to school for science. I majored in biology and I worked in biotech. When I was growing up, one of my teachers handed me a Michael Crichton book. And that was sort of one of the types of books that kind of opened my world and realized that these types of stories can do anything. You can tell a thriller and blur the lines with science fiction and think about these questions of morality. And so after that, I was really hooked. And I worked in biotech for a few years in Boston, and when I moved to North Carolina, I became a high school science teacher. And all throughout this time, I was still reading and devouring stories, but it was really after I had kids of my own where I asked myself, like, this is what I've always wanted to do. This is my passion. Why not take a real shot at it? And so the first stories I started to write with the goal of publication and giving myself the goal of reaching the end were young adult stories set in the world of high school. And they were inspired by these science what if ideas. So I feel like all of those prior careers kind of influenced the stories that I was interested in telling. And my first 5 books were young adult suspense. And it was actually the process of writing these books that sort of inspired the books I'm writing today, because I was writing these stories about these characters who had these really big things happening to them when they were 16 or 17 or 18 years old. And I would find myself thinking years later, like, well, I wonder what happens to them years later. I wonder how these huge things that really influence them influence the people they become. Are they the type of person who tries to become somebody new and leave that in the past? Are they somebody who embraces it and makes it a part of them? And thinking about those elements are what inspired my characters of today. All of my adult fiction features some element of the past in a way that kind of comes back to haunt the present day. So my first book for adults was called All the Missing Girls. And it really is about what happened to these characters when they're 18 years old, but it's 10 years later. And suddenly what happened when they were 18 is coming back into their lives with another disappearance, and it brings everything back up. And so all of my main characters seem to be grappling with some element of the past that comes back to them. And my most recent book, Such a Quiet Place, I feel like does that probably the most literally of any book I've written. There's a character in this book that is sort of what happened in the past, and she comes right back into this neighborhood. So to give you an overview of this story, Such a Quiet Place is set in this really close-knit, idyllic neighborhood where everyone believes they know everything about one another. And of course, this isn't true, and it's not quite as perfect and idyllic as people believe at the start. About a year and a half before the book takes place, there was this horrible crime that really rocked their community. A couple, neighbors, were found dead, and the neighbors all worked together using their doorbell footage or their security cameras to piece together what happened that night. And it led to the conviction of one of their neighbors named Ruby. And the book actually begins as this verdict is overturned, and Ruby comes right back into this neighborhood. And it just shakes everything up again because there's really no good answer here. And nobody's really sure if she's innocent or guilty. And if she is guilty, then there's a killer back in their neighborhood. And if she's truly innocent, then presumably a killer has been there all along without them knowing it. And so that was sort of the premise of this book. And I'm always inspired, usually by character before I come up with like the premise. And sometimes I get ideas from going for walks or going for drives. All the Missing Girls was actually inspired by my drive home from New Jersey to North Carolina. And it's one of the first scenes I wrote in the book of a character doing the same. And I was wondering about the pieces of the past that she saw along the way. And in this book in particular, I love setting books in small towns. I think there's such an interesting dynamic that you can play with in thrillers in a small town setup. And this is also why I make up all my towns, because I take someone's lovely small town and then kind of try to explore the very dark underside of it. So I was really interested in this idea of, could I pull those boundaries even tighter and set this thriller in almost a locked box of a neighborhood? And there's all these cameras where people can see who's coming and going. So in a way, your cast of suspects is known from the start. And that was one of the ideas that kind of inspired me. And I've been thinking about it for a long time. I told my friends for years, like, one day I'm going to write my neighborhood book. But I felt like I didn't really have the aha spark for the story. And I'm also someone who, I read a lot of suspense. I watch a lot of suspense. I consume, documentaries, and I listen to true crime. And at the end of everything, I would always find myself asking, I wonder what happens next. It seems like there's a resolution, but what happens to this cast of characters who's been under suspicion? How do they go about their lives after that? And in some ways, I feel like a resolution is sort of a new beginning. And that was really the spark behind this idea, because it is a book that's set mostly in aftermath. At the start of this story, the crime's already occurred. Someone's been convicted. But what happens next? What happens if what everyone thought was the truth is not? And Ruby is this person who I thought of first. I thought of the character of Ruby. What kind of person, after their conviction was overturned, would choose to come right back to this neighborhood that convicted her? And what's she there for? Is she there to clear her name? Is she there for revenge? And no one really knows. So usually when I come up with my first character, that's my main character, and that's the narrator of the story. And this was the first time that was sort of not the case. So I came up with Ruby first, but I knew she couldn't be the narrator because Ruby knows whether she did it or not. She knows if she's innocent or guilty. And I wanted to have this perspective of this cast of characters who didn't know why she was there. And so the book is told from the point of view of the main character named Harper. And Harper is in a way so different from Ruby. They were roommates earlier. Harper is somebody who hates tension. She always wants to diffuse the tension of a situation. And suddenly she's put in this position where she basically has to discover if the person she's living with is a killer or not. And she's under all this pressure from people in the neighborhood who want her to tell Ruby to go, but she's not really sure what really happened a year and a half ago. And she's coming to terms with her own role in the conviction. So when I start, I dive in and I have to write my way into a story. So I never know the ending when I'm beginning a book. And that is the case in this as well. I did not know when I started who was innocent and who was guilty. I kind of put myself in that main character and discovered alongside with them. And that's one of the joys for me in writing this type of story. As a reader, I love discovering the puzzle pieces and trying to piece together the mystery. And as a writer, that's sort of the excitement too, trying to discover the puzzle pieces as I'm writing and then try to piece them together and figure out what sort of picture I'm creating. But because that is my process, I do have to do a lot of rewriting as I figure things out. So that's my general process for writing any story is to dive in and let my main character lead the way and discover who they are and what their relationships are like. And I feel like that is how the plot almost develops. I might think a story is going a certain way, and then you realize, well, that's not what this character would choose to do. That might be what I choose to do, but it's not what my main character would choose. And so the story really takes on a life of its own.
Oh, and that's really interesting. Did you base the setting for this book on somewhere on your own neighborhood? Or I know you're up there in a lovely neighborhood in Davidson. So it just because that was what was interesting. And the lock box idea was not one I had thought about, but that's really what occurred. Because even though all of these characters lived so close to each other and seemed to think they knew each other well, they really weren't friends. They were neighbors. They were acquaintances with each other. So, and I've noticed in some of your books, your settings very often are in small towns or rural areas. And how is that? Do you find that an easier, a more interesting area to work in as a novelist to write without the distractions of an urban area that you might have to add into a story?
Yeah, I first I always give the disclaimer like this is not based on my neighborhood. My neighbors are lovely, and I've lived in neighborhoods, but I've never lived in a neighborhood quite this small before. This neighborhood is really small. It's on the border of like a lake and the woods. And not only do I love to set books in small towns, I love to set books in like the mountains or the woods, because I think there's just something really, really atmospheric about those types of settings. And I also think they're ways like they're so tied to your mood or your perspective. So these are beautiful places for the main character. Every setting I feel like is this beautiful, ideal place. But when everything turns and something starts going wrong, everything that was beautiful can be very scary instead. So these woods that were so nice that you could walk across the street and kind of cross from suburbia into your own piece of nature is suddenly really ominous, where you're wondering, well, what's watching me from the other side of the woods and what can you hide in there? And so I also feel like I always wanted to live in the mountains and the woods, and that's why I keep setting my books there. So I always have like water or woods and small towns. I do love this dynamic of small town settings. First, because I think there's an interesting thing that you can play with of like you were saying, people who believe they know everything about one another, and maybe they don't. But also in the same way that a setting can have sort of the very positive and the negative side, depending on your mood or if you're afraid. I think that can also be said for these types of relationships, where there's a comfort to this, to knowing that there's people who maybe know everything about you or who have known you your entire lives. But also, is there a danger in that in a different type of situation where maybe they know more than you want them to if you're suddenly the center of a thriller and the center of like a murder investigation? So in my books, I try to kind of take these lovely things and turn them a little bit and kind of explore like, well, what happens if this. And I think when a character is afraid, everything takes on an element of danger. And so I can kind of infuse that into a setting and in all of these relationships. Like all of these people were their friends until there's this element of danger. And then suddenly Harper or any of my characters is looking at every single character with a different eye, wondering, are they the person I thought they were? And am I the person I thought I was? Like, are we seeing each other kind of how we want to see each other, or is it the truth? And I think those are sort of shifting lines for these characters as well. And in all thrillers, I think that's kind of the fun of reading a thriller, is realizing how much depends on your perspective. And that's something they have to kind of come to terms with in this book, where they were all so sure Ruby was guilty, and that was their perspective of her. And what if there's a piece of material they were missing, and how does that change everything?
Exactly. And another thing we were kind of laughing about, we all have a tendency to hand out our house keys to somebody. And that becomes a point in the story.
Yeah.
Who are you giving them to? That kind of thing. So
Yeah.
anyway, I
Do
think
you know who has your keys?
right. Do you know actually who
Right.
has your house keys?
Right. Right. And even with, I think, everything in that way, like you're giving your key to somebody because it's a way, you view it as a way of safety, but also how could it not be that? And
Right.
all these characters have these cameras for safety. So for them, it's safety, but it's catching all these things that are not necessarily keeping them safe. It's what are they giving up in return? So I kind of like to explore both those things. Like, yes, it's safety, but in another situation, what are you kind of, giving up, I guess?
Oh. Another question that Julie just handed me. Did
Mhm.
you ever consider making Harper the murderer?
Mhm.
Well,
I leave everyone on the table when I'm writing a book. Yeah, I mean, I think, I enjoy writing unreliable narrators who are hiding something. And whether that's a big thing or a small thing depends on the character and the book. And I think there's so many types of unreliability that you can kind of explore in different ways. So there's characters who they're unreliable maybe because they don't remember, or they're misremembering, or they've been told a story so much that they believe it's true, or they're narrating a story a certain way because they don't view themselves as the villain, or even if maybe they are, they're telling a story to make themselves come off a certain way. I mean, I think of one of the things I ask myself every time I'm writing is, why is this character telling this story, and why are they telling it in this way? And I think there's a lot you can play with in those situations. So when I started the book, everybody was on the table. I did know that every character was going to be hiding something, whether those were big things or little things kind of worked itself out as it was going. But even the little things sort of added up into really big repercussions.
Well, I also like the characters Mac and Preston
Mhm.
uh, because when I was reading it, I was kind of tossed between the two of them. Like, who's really the bad guy
Right.
here?
Right.
So they were interesting, and the policeman, that
Mhm.
character, because he was determined that he had already solved the crime.
Right. Yeah. And so when I started this book, this is probably one of the larger casts that I was writing in a book. And it's basically like they all live on this one street. And not only do they live together, but most of them work together. So that's something else I wanted to kind of explore with these characters of, a group of people who maybe can't even escape one another. From home, like rumors kind of follow you both ways. So if Ruby's known a certain way at her work or at college, that isn't something she can just shake off when she comes back home. And so every one of the households sort of has a different role at this college. There's people who work in security. There's people who work as professors in the athletic department, as coaches, in admissions. The narrator works in the admissions department. And the people who died, he had been the head of admissions. So everybody is sort of interrelated. And the way they view each other is very tied to how they view each other at work and at home. And they see both sides of each other. You know, they know things about their colleagues that you wouldn't normally know because they are all home together. And in the summer, a lot of them are also off from campus. So it kind of increased the tension of the dynamic. And Ruby was a character who was always willing to shake things up. She was never somebody who was like Harper, who didn't like tension. She kind of liked tension and drama. And so I think when they were looking for somebody who was likely someone who could do something wrong, she was someone that the police officer, as soon as she was sort of spotted on the camera, she seemed like, well, this is our likely suspect. She's out there at 2 a.m. And she knows she's on these cameras, and then everyone's sort of looking for evidence that places her there as well. And you know, I think, like you were saying, sometimes you think Mac is a good guy, and then in another point of view, you're like, well, maybe Mac's not a good guy. And same with Preston. And I think that goes with all of the characters. Like, why are they doing what they're doing? What's kind of the facade they're trying to present?
Well, it seemed like the finger got pointed at Ruby from the get-go.
Yeah.
And really, without a lot of investigation, it's just, you know, she, like you say, she was the character that was kind of out of sync.
Right.
But she was also a really nice, kind of fun person too. And
Yeah.
I don't think she considered anything she was doing to be that out of the ordinary. So, and I love how the little town, how they all were kind of, Harper was kind of right there in the middle.
Yeah.
Of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So it's really a wonderful way. I have got another question here, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, one of them, and I noticed this myself, you write about lead characters that are women. Do you see yourself in any of them? And who is your favorite character?
Oh, my favorite. That's such a hard question because, so I'll start with the favorite part because I feel like it takes me a good year to write a book. Not necessarily the first draft, but, you know, a first draft and a revision. And during this time, you're so deep in this character's point of view that I always feel like the character I just finished writing from is my favorite because you get to know them so well and you get to understand the choices they would make, even if they're not the choices you would make. You sort of start to see the world from their point of view and you see what's happening around them and you understand their backstory and what's made them this way. And so I do get very connected to the main characters. Because of that, the books that took me the longest to write are the characters that sort of linger with me because they've lived in my head so long. So my first book for adults, All the Missing Girls, was my second book idea, but it was my 6th published novel. If that gives you an idea of like how many times I kept going back to this idea. They were like the characters who lived in the back of my mind that kept saying like, no, come back to this story. There's something, you know, to explore here. And so those characters lived in my head for so long that I feel very connected to them. I will say that I don't see myself in these characters. I'm fortunate that these terrible things have not happened to me and I do not have those types of experiences. But inevitably, my friends and family will read the books and they'll find little things where they'll say things like, that's how you would have phrased that. Like, I could hear you saying that. And, you know, they'll be like, there's tiny details. Like in The Girl from Widow Hills, there's this tiny line where the main character is talking about how she went to her neighbor for help for certain things that happened in like her house in the middle of the woods. And she went to her neighbor once when there was a baby bat on her front porch and she didn't know what to do in the middle of the day. And my neighbor read that and took a picture of it and was like, I remember when there was a bat on your front porch. And you called me up like, there's a bat on my front porch. So the little details always kind of find their way into the stories. They're just like little things that you can draw on. But in the big picture wise, I don't like the main concept or kind of the main backstories to the characters. They really do become their own people as you start to write them.
Another thing is with the characters, do you ever find yourself writing something about someone you know? Like, if is there a friend that shows up, a characteristic of a friend or a relative that you suddenly toss in there? Because I know some writers do at different points in time.
I actually try very hard not to. So if it is, it's totally subconscious. But like if I'm finding that I see a detail coming in, I'll actually try to take it out. So because I don't like to see, like, they become these real people. So I don't like to see a shadow of like a real person in them, but that's just my personal preference. And I think the fun is in kind of creating these characters. And I feel like so much of how they become who they are has to do with how they interact with one another and their world. So I try not to. The only time I accidentally do things is with names. And again, I try really hard not to. And like, I remember my first book when it was published, my aunt called me up. Now, this had been through so many revisions and it was finally published. And my aunt called me up and she was like, that's so funny that the parents in this book are one letter off, each your own parents' names. And I was like, oh, no. I had no idea I had done that. And like one of the characters had the same job as my mom. And I think it's just like there's familiarities that you pull on. And then there was another book where, I have a very large extended family and I'm always trying like not to use anyone's name. And I was going through one of my last revisions and realized I had used a name in another book. And I did like a quick find replace, like a name that seemed similar. And it was the bad guy. And so I won't say which name it is, but like my uncle called me up like week 1 and he was like, I need to talk to you about the ending of this book. And I was like, oh no, it's the same name. And it was just, those things happen, but it's not really ever based on a person or details of a person I know.
Okay, this is a good one. Do you follow any true crime and cast, or do you have a favorite murder mystery book? Where do you get your ideas for your stories?
Ooh,
Because do you follow true crime? Do you read true crime or?
I've watched some documentaries. I don't follow specific, like I'm not like a podcast listener. Although everyone, I feel like I should be because everyone I know is always recommending, the true crime podcast. I don't follow them. So the way I get ideas is not really from the crime itself. Which is weird to think because I write crime fiction, but I feel like the plot comes later for me and almost develops almost in opposition to the character arc. So once you know the character and you know what they're afraid of, and then you know where you want them to get at the end, you kind of almost see a plot forming in opposition. It's what they have to get through to make it out the other side. So there are sometimes inspiration points from real things, but they're never kind of the actual plot of the story. So for instance, in The Girl from Widow Hills, it was in thinking about these stories that become kind of these huge media stories that capture the public interest and like exist for decades, where you can say the name and everyone sort of remembers watching it and following it. And that had sat with me for a while. And then I remembered watching, I was following the story of the soccer team trapped in Thailand in the caves. And, how many days they'd been trapped there and when they were actually found alive. And I remember that feeling when they were found alive and how invested in this story I felt as an outsider, someone in the audience who didn't know these people, and was so invested in this story. And I started to think about a character who was the center of a huge story who maybe didn't want to be part of the story. And that was the premise for The Girl from Widow Hills. She was the center of this huge story when she was 6 years old, and she was a sleepwalker, and she was swept away in a storm while she was sleepwalking, and she was trapped for 3 days and ultimately rescued. But it became followed by, everyone in the world. And, it's this great story that she was rescued, but she didn't want to be part of it. And so she grew up and changed her name. And ultimately, the past sort of starts catching up with her 20 years later around this anniversary, where she starts sleepwalking again and wakes up standing over a dead body in her yard. And so it's a completely different type of, like, the heart of the crime is totally different, but the inspiration sometimes does come from just watching things on the news. But they're ideas that sit with me for years and years until, like, everything kind of merges together and you're like, aha, this is
when I read The Girl from Widow Hills, the first thing I thought about was, and this happened at least 20 or 25 years ago, the little girl that fell down the well.
Baby Jessica, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I thought, oh, this is this. I thought that was the story I thought of, and then of course your story took an entirely different slant on what had happened. So. But I thought about that. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
Did we hear what is your favorite murder mystery?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I have a favorite. I mean, I'm a huge reader. So
who do you like to read?
So I love, like, character-driven suspense. So one of my favorite series is Tana French's Dublin Murder Squad.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So it starts with In the Woods. And what I love about her books is how each book follows a different detective, and every crime they're solving feels like it's perfectly suited for the character arc that this detective has to take. So I'm a huge fan of all of her books. Love Harlan Coben's books and Jane Harper, and
Jane Harper's excellent. Is wonderful too. I've read her books, and it's just interesting that there's so many, or not really many, but there's a number of women writing murder mysteries now, writing mysteries, suspense thrillers, which I think it just seems to have happened in, say, the last maybe 10 years. That I feel like, for a long time, it was pretty much a male writers area. There were a number. So it's interesting to me to have so many women starting to write mysteries.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there definitely were. I mean, I read, I feel like I read both growing up. I read a lot. And like you were saying, like Agatha Christie. And I feel like the psychological suspense genre, like kind of the idea of, following in Gone Girl, where suddenly a person doesn't have to be all villain or all hero, and sort of blurring those lines has been just a really interesting thing to explore in many different ways. And I feel like there's it's such a broad category, and there's so many different types of mysteries in suspense and thrillers. And for me, I find that it's actually a really fascinating way to explore these questions and these characters, because, like, the thriller kind of puts everything in a pressure cooker. And so there's no luxury of time to say, okay, well, this is what I think someone should do. It's like, this is very revealing of character, because it's what's the decision you make in a split second. And how does that change if suddenly the situation involves your child or your parent or your sister or your best friend. You're kind of exploring those lines of morality. So I think there's just so many different possibilities within the genre, and I'm thrilled to just see it kind of, I think there's just so many wonderful writers.
Yeah, it seems that way to me too. I read one a while back, and the author's last name was Kidd, but it was called Things in Jars. She is a British writer, and it was really unusual. It had a little bit of the supernatural thrown in, which is always kind of fun, but she was a detective. And I don't know if she's going to write another one, but that would be another one I'd read.
Yes.
But a lot of the mystery writers have been British, the females, Ruth Rendell and P.D. James, and that go way back. But it's interesting. It's really interesting to me that there's so many women, American women, really starting to write.
Oh, I was a big reader of like the Karen Slaughter. She has a great series too. Yeah, I love following I love when you can follow like the detectives in several different situations too. And I was a big like Sue Grafton. I loved like the alphabet.
Oh yeah, and the main character, carrying that main character through.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about writing in a different genre? I know you wrote young adult. Have you ever thought about writing in like romance or anything other than the suspense thrillers?
I think, I'll never say never, but every time that I think of an idea, it always turns like, and here's the mystery at the heart. Like, I think there's just something to, I just love mysteries. And so I think no matter what I wrote, there'd be some sort of element of a mystery at the core of it.
Well, a murder's always good. It creates a lot of tension there.
Yeah.
I definitely, I know you can't see me, but I'm in the corner. I'm dying to know about the last house guest being selected as Reese Witherspoon's book club pick. Well, I mean, that's so exciting. What was that like? I mean, can you describe when you like got the call or how you were notified?
Yeah. Oh, it totally blew my mind. It was the most fantastic experience. Incredibly honored. So, I mean, it's like an incredible community of writers in her book club and readers in her book club. So, my book, The Last House Guest, came out the end of June. And I didn't know when the book came out. And I had just gotten back from my first leg of book tour. And my editor called me. I got a call on a Saturday. And I was like, why am I getting a call on a Saturday? And she told me that it was going to be Reese's book club pick for August. And I think I made her repeat it like 5 times because it was like, really? Is this really happening? I just couldn't imagine. It just was beyond my wildest dreams. And then she said, so we can't say anything till then. So I didn't tell a soul. Like I locked it away and kept it. Like I didn't even think about it because it was just this incredible experience. And I thought as soon as it's announced, I'm going to like screenshot it and I'll send it to my family then. And by the time it was announced, half my family had already seen it and started texting me. So it was so exciting because they were seeing it before I even had time to kind of send it to them. And it was such a whirlwind. It was just amazing.
Any chance, have you talked to anyone about making any of your books into film?
Yes. So the one I can talk about is that The Last House Guest was optioned for television by Dakota and Elle Fanning's production company. So it's still kind of early stages right now, but there is a great writer who is working on it, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed. It's very exciting.
Oh, that sounds exciting.
Well, I was going to say, I'm sure since you were a pick from her book club, you follow the book club. Do you have any favorite selections that she has picked, prior or after you that you would recommend?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I do. I follow the book club. I was following it beforehand. And Oh, there's so many. I mean, Ruth Ware's were her book club pick. Daisy Jones and the Six. I just adored that book. And what I love too is how she picks kind of different types of books too. So We Were Never Here was her August pick, which is a really, really cool, creepy dynamic of friendship and backpackers where a crime occurs when they're on vacation in South America. So yeah, I'm a big follower of all of the book club's books. Yeah.
We have another question from Michelle. Can you read that?
Sure.
Want me to read it?
I have a question from Michelle Wall. What are the big differences in your young adult and adult novels? Do you think it's easier to publish in young adult?
That's a good. So it's a good question because I get asked about the difference in the writing process a lot, and I've been thinking about it a lot, and I don't approach them very differently. I write all my books from first person point of view. So the main way that it differs for me is the perspective that you're filtering things through. And that's really the only difference. So when I'm writing young adult, I think like one of the core elements of a young adult story is a character who's experiencing something for the first time, kind of putting these situations into a context and discovering kind of their place in the world, and who they are and who they want to be, which is not something that necessarily changes in adulthood. I think the difference in the adult perspective is that for me, it's a character who is filtering what's happening through their decades of lived experience. And so there's this element of hindsight to the stories where in young adult, for me, it's a little more immediate, and maybe a heightened emotion because of that. But that's not like a general rule. Like that's just kind of how I see it. And so when I'm thinking of a story and I'm thinking about whether it's young adult or adult, it really comes down to who is the character telling this story, or who's the character who should be telling this story. And that's how it kind of becomes apparent whether it's young adult or adult. That's the only way that I kind of view it differently. I don't think one is easier or harder to write than the other. They have different, there's just a little bit of a difference. And I don't think one is necessarily harder or easier to publish in. So I haven't felt that way for myself anyway. But thank you for that question.
Yeah. And another one you just said, and I was thinking about it when you were talking, you write in the first person.
Mm-hmm.
Is that because you like to keep that character without knowledge?
Yeah.
Of what's going. Yeah, because the third person, they would know more. And if they're in the first person, they only know so much.
Yeah, I like it because, like I said, when I start writing, I don't know what happens. So I like to put myself into that character's point of view where she doesn't know and I don't know. And so both of us are kind of looking at this cast like, any one of you could have done it. Like, what's everyone's motivation? But then, like, who's the character who actually does it? And so I like that uncertainty when I write, and I try to channel that emotion, because even if I can't connect to these events that are happening, because I've never been in those situations, I can try to connect to that emotion of either fear or distrust or uncertainty and kind of write that character authentically. So I'm very drawn to the first person for that reason.
How do you add those other characters in? Do you, because it's in your plotting, you have to come up with other people.
Yeah.
Do you know ahead of time when you're writing?
No.
Which you don't.
No, I mean, I feel like I probably do not have the most efficient writing process, because I just dive in and you start writing. You're like, oh, here's a character popping on the screen. Like, let's see who they are and what they're like. And I mean, it feels, but that is how I develop a story. Like, it just, they move into a new situation and there's new people who pop onto the page. And then sometimes you take a step back and you think things through, like, who are they? What's their relationship beforehand? But when I start, I just kind of jump in. Sometimes I'll have an idea. Like for this book in particular, it was a little more mapped out, because there is even a map at the start of this book, because every character had a piece of evidence that was used in this trial based on their camera. It had to be pretty clear kind of who lived in what house and what piece of evidence they would have. And so one of the first scenes I wrote of this book was Harper watching Ruby walk down the street towards the pool. And as she's walking, she's kind of narrating, and she walked by this person's house who had this piece of evidence. And she's walking by this person's house who had this and said this. And that kind of gave me a sense of who these different people were. And then I tried to tie each house to kind of a different role at their work, which helped me distinguish who they were. But other than that, it kind of becomes freeing. You kind of discover as you go. I did try also, because there's a larger cast, I tried to make every house kind of have a unique dynamic. So you have the one where it's the brothers who live together. You have one where it's a daughter who brought her parents to live with her. And then you have the mom who has the two teenagers, so that each house, it was a little easier to keep straight. Like, and here's the one who has the baby with the stroller. So that kind of helped round out the cast in that way. But a lot of times I start writing and characters appear, and then I take a step back and figure out how they are, which I know sounds like there's no rhyme or reason to it.
What did you think about, like, this whole doorbell camera thing now has just kind of boomed in the last couple of years? Did you have that in mind as a device when you started?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's central to your plot.
It is. And I was thinking about it because I was actually thinking about how different it would be from 10 years ago or 15 years ago to now, how different crimes could be investigated, and how much now is really in the hands of people who maybe aren't in law enforcement. And so you have a group of people who believe they can solve a crime and who want to solve a crime. And they believe they have the pieces to do it on their own, because each of them has a camera and they have this central message board where they share it all together. So when I started that book, I did have that in mind, that I wanted to have this message board that was almost a way to give every character a voice, not just Harper, and that maybe you could get to know a character in a different way, because there's things they might not say face to face that they're very happy to say passive aggressively to each other on the message board. And you can kind of see like a different layer of their personality that way. So those dynamics were in my mind when I started, because it was thinking about, okay, what happens if everybody has a camera? What are they seeing? But also, how can those be kind of used against you? I mean, technology is not infallible. If you know there's a camera there, presumably you know how to avoid the camera too. So it's kind of a different way to kind of explore that, I guess.
Did we have any more?
This is an interesting question.
Okay.
Do you ever take on the persona of any of your characters?
I don't, and like I try to really compartmentalize my writing, because I am writing these very dark things, and sometimes I'm researching dark things, and I'm talking to people about darker things, and so it helps me to be very structured. Even though my drafting process is not structured, my work hours are very structured, and so I write in the same place every day. I write normally the same hours every day. I, like, my kids go to school, I come to my office, I close the door, and that's where I do my writing. And at the end of the day, I leave my laptop behind and I close the door so I can kind of go to the rest of my life. The thing that will sometimes linger is not like a persona, but sometimes things I'm researching will stick in my mind. So I was writing, it's a YA book that I wrote called The Safest Lies. And it's basically about a girl who's been raised in this element of fear her entire life. Her mom hasn't left the house in 17 years, and she set up this house as a fortress. And so the main character is kind of coming to terms with, is there something to fear, or is this something that I've kind of learned? And of course, the danger then rapidly approaches. But as I was doing all this research about like security systems, and all the things this house could have that was set up like a fortress. And some in the middle of like this research, I became convinced. I was like, surely I need a panic room. Like, this is apparently a thing people must have, is a panic room, because I was writing this story. And then as soon as I was done writing this story, I was like, oh no, I don't need a panic room. My neighbors can hear me if I yell too loud. Like, everyone is very close. But the research sometimes is something that kind of lingers and makes you think. So that can sometimes be harder to leave behind than the actual characters, where you kind of are like, okay, it's in the Word document, and then you kind of close the door and leave that part behind.
Yeah.
Oh, this is one. What is next? What do you, because I know you get a book out usually every year.
Yeah.
Have you started working on something?
So I just turned in my final draft, actually, I think. Fingers crossed. So it comes out next summer. There'll be more information about it very soon. What I can say right now is this will come to a surprise as no one. Like, it's again set in a small town. It's set in a small North Carolina town, a mountain town. And it's a town that's become kind of notoriously famous for a string of disappearances over the last 25 years. And it's narrated by the manager of the inn, which is right off kind of the Appalachian Trail. And it's the place where the last person has gone missing from.
Does it have a title?
I think so. I think it's, but because I'm not 100% sure, I'm going to hold off on saying that, because it's changed a little bit. It's been,
Well, we're definitely going to be looking forward to that one.
thank you.
It's fun to read them that we know that are set in our region too.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's it.
That's it. And well, thank you. This has
Thank
been
you.
wonderful, and I hope our audience has enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun for us once we got ourselves in here. So thank you so much, Megan. We
No,
look
I really
forward-
enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, we're delighted, and we will all be looking forward to your new book. And as I was going to mention, Such a Quiet Place is available at Park Road Books, as well as her other books, which are in paperback, which is nice too. So we're very excited and happy for you, and look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody,
I'm
lean
trying to come in. I'm
Lean
trying to come
in.
in.
I'll move over. There we are. Thank you so
it was
much.
so nice to meet you.
It was great to
You too.
What do we do?